It started on a Tuesday morning in April. A dump truck backed straight onto my lawn. Pallets of lumber. A porta potty. My neighbors watched from their porches. Silent. I stayed calm and asked one simple question. Whose permission did you have for this? The HOA president's smile told me everything. By the end of that summer, she'd regret it. My name is Sarah Voss, accountant, and a single mother to my son Eli, age 9. 2 years earlier, we'd moved into Willow Creek Estates, a quiet cul-de-sac community outside Columbus, because the schools were good and the yard was big enough for Eli's dog, Biscuit. I liked the neighborhood. Block parties. A Facebook group full of lost cat alerts. I'd met the HOA president, Diane Kowalski, exactly twice, once at closing, once at a garden club meeting where she complimented my mailbox, and then, a week later, fined me for it. Diane Kowalski had run the Willow Creek HOA board for 11 years. She was in her late 50s. Always in tennis whites even though nobody had seen her play tennis. And she treated the community bylaws like scripture only she was qualified to interpret. People joked about her behind closed garage doors. "Don't let Diane see that," became a running gag whenever someone put out a trash can an hour early. Nobody joked to her face. The last person who did, the Hendersons, ended up with a lien on their house over a birdbath. My back property line bordered a lot owned by Ron Fisher, a contractor who'd bought the empty parcel next to mine to build what he called his forever home. Ron and Diane, turned out, went way back. She'd officiated his second wedding. Nobody had explained that connection to me when I bought the house. I only learned it later, and only because I started asking the wrong questions to the wrong people at the wrong time, which, looking back, was the best decision I ever made. Ron's construction crew showed up in April, months ahead of any permit sign I could see posted. Trucks idled at 6 a.m. Dust settled on my car every morning. I didn't love it, but I told myself, new construction, this is temporary. Be a good neighbor. Then one Tuesday, without a knock on my door or a word of warning, Ron's crew unloaded 2 full pallets of lumber, a stack of cinder blocks, and a portable toilet directly onto my side yard. Not his lot, mine, claiming his own lot was too tight to stage materials. I walked out in my robe, coffee in hand, and asked the foreman what was happening. He shrugged. Cleared with the HOA. I said nothing had been cleared with me, the actual property owner. He shrugged again and kept unloading. I called Ron directly, almost amused. It's just for a couple weeks, Sarah. Diane said it was fine since your side yard's not fenced anyway. I'll toss you a case of beer for the trouble. I did not want beer. I wanted my yard back. I photographed everything, timestamps, angles, the porta potty practically brushing my son's swing set. I filed a polite, documented complaint with the HOA management portal that same afternoon, expecting a routine resolution. 2 neighbors quietly told me, almost in warning tones, "Good luck with that." 3 days passed with no reply. The lumber stayed. The toilet outside 15 feet from his swings. I told him it was temporary. I was already starting to suspect that word meant something different to Ron and Diane than it did to me. On day 4, Diane finally called, not about the lumber, but about my mailbox flag, which she said violated Uniform Hardware Code 4.2. She never once mentioned the construction materials sitting on my private lot. I asked her directly. "I'll look into it," she said, in the tone people use when they have no intention of looking into anything. Then, almost as an afterthought, "Ron's a longtime friend of the community. Sarah, try to be flexible. New neighbors sometimes don't understand how things work here." I hung up and sat with that sentence for a long time. How things work here. Phrase went. But I felt, in my chest, the particular cold of realizing you've just met a wall dressed up as a person. A week later, the pile had grown, more lumber, a stack of roofing shingles, 2 idle generators, all still on my side yard, none of it Ron's own property line. I sent a second complaint, this time with a survey map showing the exact boundary in red. Diane's response arrived within an hour, faster than anything before. Not an apology. Addressed to me, citing unsightly exterior storage and a $150 fine, due in 15 days, for materials I hadn't ordered, didn't own, and had asked 3 times to remove. I laughed out loud, alone in my kitchen, the kind of laugh that isn't really about anything funny. I called the HOA office. The woman who answered sounded uncomfortable. "Ma'am, Diane signed off on that one personally. I really can't override her on this." I asked to see the covenant clause she'd cited. She emailed me a scanned PDF, decades old, edges yellowed, clearly photocopied from an original binder nobody had touched in years. Buried in the margins of that same document was a line I almost skipped past entirely. Section 9. Subsection C. Any construction materials, equipment, or waste stored on a lot other than the owner's assigned lot are subject to a daily storage fee, payable by the party responsible for placement, retroactive to date of first delivery. I read it twice. I didn't say anything yet. Saved the PDF to 3 different places, and closed my laptop. For the first time since the dump truck showed up, I felt something other than frustration. I felt the beginning of a plan. I called my cousin Priya, a paralegal, and read her the clause. She went quiet for a second, then said, "Sarah, that's not a suggestion. That's an enforceable contract term buried in a document everyone forgot existed. Don't tip your hand yet." So I documented. Time-stamped, GPS tagged. A spreadsheet with delivery dates, item counts, estimated dimensions. I labeled the tab Ron stuff at first, then renamed it Exhibit A week later, half as a joke, half not. Diane, meanwhile, seemed to sense none of this. She fined me again, this time for a garden gnome she claimed violated seasonal decor guidelines, despite the gnome having sat in that exact spot since the day I moved in, entirely unremarked upon for 2 years. At the next HOA social, a wine and cheese thing in the clubhouse, Diane made a point of greeting everyone but me by name. When our eyes met, she smiled thinly and said, "Still adjusting to the neighborhood, Sarah?" I smiled back. "Getting there, Ron." For his part, seemed to think the whole thing was a mild inconvenience he'd already resolved with a case of beer I never accepted. He waved at me across the fence line most mornings, oblivious, whistling, while the pile of his materials kept quietly growing on my land. I noticed something odd about the delivery schedule. Materials kept arriving even when Ron's own crew wasn't on site, as if someone else were coordinating drop-offs. I mentioned this to my neighbor Marisol, who'd lived there 12 years. She lowered her voice immediately. Diane and Ron's wife co-chair the beautification committee, Marisol said. There's a fund. A real accounting of it. She wouldn't say more than that, glancing toward Diane's house like the walls themselves might report back to her. That night I couldn't sleep. Retroactive to date of first delivery, and running numbers in my head. Even at a conservative daily rate, weeks of accumulated storage on my property was already adding up to a serious sum. I decided not to say a word to Ron or Diane yet. Instead, I emailed the HOA management company directly, a separate entity from the volunteer board, requesting the full, original, notarized version of the governing covenants, not the scanned copy Diane had sent me. It took 2 weeks and a polite but firm follow-up, but eventually a certified copy arrived by mail. Section 9, subsection C was there in full, original language, including a penalty escalator clause I hadn't seen in the scan. Fees compounding for every 7 days unresolved. I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator, my hands actually shaking a little. I wasn't imagining the math. If Ron's materials stayed where they were much longer, the escalator alone would turn a modest storage fee into something enormous, and entirely, legally, his responsibility. Priya reviewed the language and confirmed it was airtight. If unusual, the kind of overzealous clause a founding developer writes in the 1980s and nobody ever expects to actually use. It's real, she said. It's enforceable. The fight. I looked out my kitchen window at the porta-potty 15 feet from my son's swing set, at the cinder blocks bleaching gray in the sun, at Diane's violation notice still magnet to my fridge for a garden gnome. I already knew my answer. I decided to give Ron one final, documented, certified mail warning before I did anything else. 30 days to remove every item from my property. Or I would begin formally invoking Section 9, subsection C, retroactive to the original delivery date in April. I mailed it on a Friday. Return receipt requested. Ron signed for it Monday morning. By Wednesday, Diane was pounding on my front door, red in the face, holding a printed copy of my letter like it had personally insulted her. You can't be serious, Diane said, not even waiting for me to finish opening the door. That clause hasn't been enforced in 30 years. It's a formality. This. I asked her, calmly, who exactly had decided it was only a formality. She didn't answer that. Familiar tactic, reminding me that Ron was practically family in the neighborhood, that I was new, that this kind of thing just isn't how we do things here. I'd heard that phrase enough times now to recognize it as a threat. I told her the letter stood, her tennis whites practically vibrating with fury, and got straight into her car. I watched her drive, not toward her own house, but straight toward Ron's job site, phone already pressed to her ear. Within the hour, 2 of Ron's workers showed up and hauled away exactly 1 pallet of lumber, leaving everything else untouched, as if that single token gesture would satisfy the letter. I photographed the remaining pile and noted the date. The clock, as far as I was concerned, kept running. That weekend, a new violation notice appeared in my mailbox. Not about the gnome this time. Not about lumber. modification of the property line fence. A fence I hadn't touched, hadn't hired anyone to touch, and hadn't even noticed had changed at all. I walked the property line with my phone camera. Someone had, in fact, moved 2 fence posts roughly 18 inches onto my side, expanding Ron's usable lot space by a sliver, just enough, I'd later learn, to make his planned structure clear a permit-required setback line. I didn't fix the fence. As it was, filed a police report for the record, not expecting action, just documentation, and sent a copy of everything to Priya with one line, "It's getting worse. I think it's on purpose now." Priya's answer came back fast. "Sarah, this isn't random pettiness anymore. Moving a boundary marker to gain buildable space is a specific, deliberate move. Someone with construction knowledge did that. This isn't about a garden gnome. Something bigger is going on." I started paying closer attention to Ron's site plans, which, as a homeowner adjacent to active construction, I was legally entitled to request. The HOA stalled me for 10 days. When the plans finally arrived, they were for a structure far larger than a forever home addition. Attached to the plans, buried in a footnote I almost missed, was a secondary unit designation, a detached accessory dwelling, the kind explicitly banned under Willow Creek's own covenants, the very covenants Diane enforced against me over a mailbox flag and a garden gnome. I sat with that footnote for a long time. Diane, keeper of every rule, guardian of every fence height and flag color, had apparently looked the other way on an entire illegal structure being built by her friend, on land partly stolen from mine by a moved property marker. I didn't confront anyone yet. Priya's advice was clear: build the file before you light the match. So I kept building photos, dates, the fence survey, the plan footnote, the violation notices against me stacked beside the ones Ron never received for anything. Around this time, my neighbor Marisol left an unmarked envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a printed screenshot of the HOA's Beautification Fund ledger. Forwarded from a board email chain she wasn't supposed to have access to anymore since resigning from the committee. The ledger showed a line item, $3,000. Paid out to Site Prep Services. No vendor name. No invoice number attached. Dated the same week Ron's crew first delivered materials onto my land. I stared at that number until the digits stopped making sense. I texted Marisol a single word. "Why?" she called instead of texting back. "I quit the committee because Diane kept overriding receipts," she said. "I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry. Up on your lawn." Literally. I told her it wasn't her fault, and I meant it, but I also understood, in that moment, exactly how long this pattern had probably existed, quietly, before I'd ever bought my house. Diane hadn't started this system for Ron. She'd built it years before I arrived. The 30-day letter deadline came and went. Roughly half of Ron's materials remained on my land, plus the porta potty, which had, absurdly, started to smell in the summer heat, close enough that Eli refused to use the swing set at all anymore. I called Priya, said. She walked me through drafting a formal invoice under Section 9. Subsection C, itemized by material type, delivery date, days stored, and the compounding penalty clause, addressed directly to Ron Fisher. CC to the HOA management company, not the board. The final number, Once the escalator clause compounded across the actual weeks involved, came out to roughly 23 times what a flat, unescalated storage fee would have been. Even I gasped a little at the total. It was real. It was his own community's rule. I mailed the invoice certified, with 30 days to pay before I filed a mechanic-style lien claim against his adjacent lot. Per the covenant's own enforcement language, the same enforcement mechanism Diane had cheerfully threatened against me over a mailbox flag months earlier. 2 days later, my phone rang before 7 a.m. It was Ron, and for the first time since April, he did not sound breezy at all. "Sarah, what is this? This has to be a joke." Diane said this clause was dead. "It's not dead," I said. "It's just never been used against someone Diane liked." There was a long silence on the line, the kind where you can practically hear someone recalculating every assumption they'd made about a situation they thought was already settled. Ron tried a different approach that afternoon. A knock at my door, flowers, an apology that sounded rehearsed. "Let's just work this out neighbor to neighbor," he said. "No need to involve lawyers." I told him the invoice already was the neighborly solution, the covenant's own words, not mine. He asked if I'd consider adjusting the number if he moved everything within the week. I told him I'd consider following the covenant exactly as written. The same standard applied to me for a garden gnome, and not $1 less, unless the board formally waived it in writing. That last part mattered. I was asking Diane's own rulebook to apply equally, on paper, in front of witnesses, because I already suspected that once this went to the full board, not just Diane alone, the story would look very different. I requested, in writing, that the invoice dispute be placed on the agenda for the next full HOA board meeting, not resolved quietly between Diane and Ron behind closed doors, as I suspected she intended. Bylaws required board disputes over $500 to go before the full membership. This easily qualified. Diane tried to reach me twice that week. I let both calls go to voicemail and responded only in writing, through the management portal, creating a clean, time-stamped paper trail of every single interaction from that point forward, exactly as Priya had coached me to do. In her second message, left at 11:40 p.m., Diane's voice had lost its usual polish. "Sarah, this is going to cause problems for both of us if it goes to a vote. I really think we should talk before this gets out of hand." I saved the recording. I didn't call her back. I quietly reached out to 3 other homeowners who'd received strange, seemingly arbitrary violation notices over the past 2 years, the Hendersons and their birdbath, a retired teacher fined for a flagpole, a young couple fined for a basketball hoop. Each of them, once they realized I wasn't alone in this, opened up fast. Patterns emerged. Fines issued right after homeowners questioned Diane publicly. Fines waived for anyone in her closer social circle. An HOA reserve fund nobody outside the board had ever actually seen a full report on. By the time the board meeting date was confirmed, I had 4 other frustrated homeowners willing to attend, a stack of inconsistent violation records, a boundary line police report, a beautification fund ledger screenshot, and one 23 times storage invoice sitting like a lit fuse in the middle of it all. For 2 weeks, things went strangely quiet. No new violation notices appeared in my mailbox. Ron's crew didn't touch the remaining materials at all, as though moving them might somehow be read as an admission. Diane, for once, said nothing to me directly. I used the calm to prepare, not relax. Priya helped me organize everything into a single binder, tabbed, dated, cross-referenced, the kind of document that speaks for itself the moment someone flips past the first page. I made 5 copies, one for each concerned neighbor. Eli asked me one evening why I'd been working so much on the computer instead of playing. I told him I was fixing something unfair that had happened in our yard. He considered this seriously, the way 9-year-olds do, and said, "Good. The toilet still smells." Marisol quietly confirmed she'd testify, if it came to that, about the beautification fund irregularities she'd witnessed while still on the committee, a decision she said had less to do with me and more to do with finally being tired of staying quiet. I ran into Ron once during that quiet stretch. At the mailbox cluster, both of us pretending to be very interested in our envelopes. He finally said, "Lo," almost embarrassed, "I didn't know it would get this complicated." Diane told me it'd be fine. I believed him, a little. That admission, Diane told me it'd be fine, stuck with me more than any of the fines had. It suggested Ron wasn't the true architect of this. He was, in his own clumsy way, the tool. The person who'd built the pattern was still upstream of him. I started to feel something unexpected during that quiet stretch. Not triumph exactly, but steadiness. For months I'd absorbed every fine, every dismissive phone call, every, "That's just how we do things here," without pushing back hard. Now, for the first time, the paperwork was on my side. One neighbor, an older man named Frank who'd lived in Willow Creek since it was built, stopped me while I was walking Biscuit. "Diane's had this coming a long time," he said. "Nobody ever had the paper trail before. Most folks just moved away instead of fighting." That comment stayed with me. How many people, I wondered, had simply sold their houses and left rather than face down a board president who treated the covenants as a personal weapon? I didn't want to be one more name on that quiet list. 2 days before the board meeting, Diane sent one final message through the official portal, polite on its surface, cold underneath. "Looking forward to a productive discussion Thursday. I'm confident we can find a reasonable resolution that works for everyone." I read it 3 times. Unmoved, I replied with a single line, "I'm looking forward to the board seeing everything." I didn't specify what everything meant. I wanted her to sit with that uncertainty the way I'd been sitting with a porta potty outside my son's window for months. The night before the meeting, I laid out 5 printed binders on my kitchen table, checked every tab twice, and reread the storage fee invoice one final time. 23 times the base rate. Retroactive to first delivery. Her own covenant. Nothing invented. Nothing exaggerated. Eli found me still at the table past his bedtime and asked if I was nervous. "A little," I admitted. He hugged me around the middle and said, "You always fix things, Mom." I didn't correct him, but privately I thought, this time, the rules were going to fix it for me. The Willow Creek clubhouse was packed Thursday night. More homeowners than I'd ever seen at a board meeting. Word having quietly spread through the same neighborhood grapevine that had once warned me. Good luck with that. Now it seemed to be working in my favor. Diane sat at the head table in her usual spot, flanked by 2 board members who rarely spoke. A fresh manicure and a folder of her own notes in front of her, projecting the same confident calm she'd used on me the very first week the lumber arrived. The meeting opened with routine business, landscaping bids, a pool schedule, while the real agenda item sat waiting like a held breath. When my name was finally called, I stood, binder in hand, and felt Eli's words from the night before settle into my shoulders. I laid out the timeline first. Plainly, without embellishment, the delivery date, the unremoved materials, the fines issued to me instead of Ron, the moved fence posts, the boundary survey, the covenant clause itself. Read aloud in full so no one in the room could later claim confusion. Diane interrupted twice, insisting the clause was outdated and never meant to be enforced literally. I calmly asked her, in front of the full room, whether she'd extended that same generous interpretation to my mailbox flag fine or my garden gnome violation. The room went very quiet. I introduced the beautification fund ledger next, the $3,000 site prep services line item. No vendor, no invoice, dated the exact week Ron's materials first arrived on my property. Diane's face changed color slightly, though her voice stayed level. That's a clerical matter, she said. Marisol stood then, unprompted, and confirmed from her own time on the committee that Diane had personally overridden 2 separate requests for that vendor's documentation. A murmur moved through the room, the specific kind of murmur that means people are quietly recalculating who they thought they knew. Frank stood next, unasked, and said simply that in 18 years he'd never once seen the storage clause invoked because, he said, nobody with the nerve to check the actual documents ever crossed Diane before. A few people actually laughed. Not unkindly, but pointedly. The Hendersons stood after that, describing their own birdbath fine and the lean threat that followed, and the young couple with the basketball hoop, and the retired teacher with the flagpole, each account small on its own, but together forming a pattern impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Diane tried to regain control of the room, reminding everyone that personal grievances weren't the purpose of this meeting, that the only real agenda item was my storage fee dispute with Ron. I agreed, and said that was exactly why I'd brought the boundary survey next. I displayed the property survey showing the fence posts moved 18 inches onto my land, time-stamped against the police report I'd filed, and noted that the shift conveniently cleared the exact setback distance required for the accessory dwelling unit hidden in Ron's submitted plans. Ron, sitting quietly in the 3rd row until that point, stood up abruptly. I didn't move any fence posts, he said, visibly rattled. I paid a crew Diane recommended for site prep. I never told anyone to touch the property line. I swear I didn't know. All eyes shifted to Diane. For the first time all evening, she didn't have a smooth answer ready. I simply connected Ron with a reliable contractor, she said. What that contractor did on-site isn't something I can be held responsible for. Her voice had lost its usual polish. I asked, calmly, who had approved payment for that reliable contractor out of the beautification fund with no invoice attached. Diane said the treasurer had approved it. The treasurer, sitting 2 seats down from her, said quietly into the silence. Diane told me it was pre-approved by the full board. It wasn't. That single sentence seemed to crack something open in the room. Board members who'd rarely spoken suddenly had questions. One asked to see the full fund ledger, not just the one-line item. Another asked how many other site prep payments existed with no vendor names attached. Diane tried once more to steer the meeting back toward my invoice specifically, insisting the storage fee dispute was the only binding matter tonight, and that everything else should be tabled for a future session. The board president, running from her own fund records, didn't play the way she hoped. A homeowner near the back, someone I didn't even know, called out, "Table it? You find half this room over gnomes and flagpoles, and you want to table an unaccounted $3,000. The room erupted into overlapping conversation for the first time all night. The board chair, not Diane, technically a separate elected position, though she'd long treated it as ceremonial, finally called for order and announced, over Diane's objection, that the beautification fund would be independently audited before any further board action. Per emergency bylaw provision 14. I hadn't even known provision 14 existed until that exact moment. And from the look on Diane's face, I suspect she'd hoped no one else did either. It allowed any 5 homeowners to force a financial audit with proper petition, and I already had 5 signatures ready in my binder. I submitted the petition on the spot. Diane's expression, for just a second, wasn't composed at all. It was something closer to fear. The look of someone watching a system they'd quietly relied on for over a decade suddenly slip entirely out of their hands. The meeting adjourned late, without a final vote on my storage invoice, but with an emergency audit approved unanimously, including pointedly by the 2 board members who normally never disagreed with Diane in public. I walked out with Marisol and Frank, binder still under my arm. That went further than I expected, Frank said, shaking his head slowly. I've watched her run this neighborhood like a private kingdom for over a decade. Never thought I'd see the room turn on her in one night. I said nothing, but I felt it too. Something had shifted for good. The audit took 3 weeks. An outside accounting firm, chosen specifically because they had no ties to anyone in Willow Creek, combed through 5 years of HOA financial records, not just the beautification fund. Once the scope quietly expanded during the first week of review, word moved through the neighborhood faster than the audit itself. Someone had leaked a preliminary summary showing over $11,000 in undocumented vendor payments across multiple years, several traced back to the same LLC, one registered, turned out, to Diane's own son-in-law. I hadn't known that detail, apparently, until the audit pulled the business registration records. Diane's son-in-law ran a landscaping and site services company that had somehow won every single unbid HOA contract for 3 consecutive years without ever formally submitting a competing quote. Ron called me again during this stretch, sounding almost dazed. I had no idea any of that was going on, he said. I just thought I was getting a favor from a friend of the family. I feel like an idiot. I told him he wasn't the one on trial here. I meant that. Entitled, dismissive of boundaries in the most literal sense. But Diane had been something else entirely. Deliberate, patient, and quietly profitable off a system she alone controlled the interpretation of. For over a decade. Unquestioned. Diane, meanwhile, went unusually quiet on the neighborhood Facebook group, a platform she'd previously used almost daily to post reminders about trash can placement and holiday decoration deadlines. Her silence felt louder than anything she could have written. A second board meeting was scheduled specifically to review the audit's preliminary findings. Attendance, if anything, was even higher than before. Folding chairs lined up along the clubhouse walls. People standing in the doorway. The kind of turnout Willow Creek hadn't seen in a decade. Before that meeting even began, I received a private message from a board member I barely knew, asking to meet me for coffee. Over lattes at a chain cafe 2 towns over. She quietly admitted she'd suspected irregularities for years, but had never had documentation solid enough to act on. You gave us something to actually point to, she said. Before, it was just a feeling. Now it's a paper trail. I thought about how long that feeling must have existed in this neighborhood. Unspoken, absorbed by people too tired or too outmatched to fight it directly. The second meeting opened with the audit firm's lead accountant presenting findings directly, bypassing Diane's usual gatekeeping of the agenda entirely. $11,000 in undocumented payments. A pattern of unbid contracts to a related party. Inconsistent fine enforcement with no documented criteria whatsoever. Diane attempted, one more time, to frame the discrepancies as administrative oversight. Nothing more, insisting she'd never personally profited $1. The accountant, without missing a beat, noted that personal profit wasn't required for a conflict of interest violation under the HOA's own governing bylaws, only undisclosed relationship and preferential treatment. I watched something visibly leave her posture in that moment. Not collapse exactly, but the particular deflation of someone realizing the story they'd told themselves for years no longer held up under a single outside pair of eyes actually reading the fine print. A motion was raised from the floor, seconded almost immediately, to hold a formal recall vote on Diane's board presidency at the earliest bylaw-permitted date, alongside a separate motion to review, and likely reverse, every disputed violation fine issued over the prior 3 years. Diane requested a chance to address the community directly before any vote was scheduled. The chair allowed it, adjusted her blazer, and gave what I can only describe as the most polished, least convincing speech I've ever personally witnessed in real time. She talked about her decade of dedicated service, her vision for the neighborhood's property values, her difficult, thankless decisions made only in the community's best interest. Nobody in the room looked moved. A few people near me were quietly, visibly checking their phones. When she finished, there was a long, uncomfortable silence before the chair simply said, "Thank you, Diane," and moved directly to scheduling the recall vote for 4 weeks out, per bylaw minimum notice requirements. No applause. Just quiet, procedural momentum now working entirely against her. Outside afterward, in the clubhouse parking lot, Diane approached me directly for the first time since our doorstep confrontation months earlier. Her voice was low, controlled, but I could hear something underneath it now that hadn't been there in April. Real, specific worry. "I hope you're satisfied," she said. "I built this community's property values over 11 years. This is how I'm repaid." I told her, honestly, that I hadn't set out to remove her from anything. I'd only ever wanted a porta potty moved off my son's swing set. "Everything after that," I said, "was just you refusing to apply your own rules evenly." She didn't have an answer for that. She got into her car and drove off without another word. And it struck me that in 11 years, this might have been the first time she genuinely hadn't. Ron's remaining materials disappeared from my yard within 48 hours of that meeting. No lawyers, no further negotiation needed. He paid the full storage invoice in a single certified check 2 weeks later, along with a handwritten note apologizing, which I did not expect and quietly appreciated. The recall vote, for weeks later, wasn't even close. Diane was removed from the board with over 80% of homeowners voting in favor. An unprecedented margin according to the management company's own historical records for Willow Creek since its founding decades earlier. A new interim board took over immediately, including Frank, Marisol, and, somewhat to my surprise, myself, nominated from the floor the same night as treasurer. specifically tasked with overseeing the fine review, the fund reconciliation, and drafting clearer, evenly applied enforcement guidelines going forward. I hesitated before accepting. Priya told me, only half joking, "You basically already did the job for free for 6 months. Might as well get the title." I said yes, mostly for Eli, who deserved a neighborhood where fairness wasn't something you had to fight a paper war to receive. Diane's son-in-law's landscaping contract was terminated within the week. The accessory dwelling unit on Ron's lot was formally reported to the county for permit review, and Ron, to his credit, cooperated fully, seemed to distance himself from the whole arrangement entirely. One evening, packing up the last of the audit paperwork at the clubhouse, Marisol asked me if I felt any satisfaction watching it all unravel the way it had. I thought about the porta potty, the gnome fine, the moved fence posts, and said, honestly, more relief than anything. Diane did not disappear quietly. 2 weeks after the recall vote, she filed a formal complaint with the HOA management company alleging that the audit itself had been improperly initiated, and that Provision 14 had been misapplied to target her personally rather than address genuine concerns. The management company reviewed her complaint and dismissed it within days, noting the petition had been signed by 5 verified homeowners exactly as bylaws required, with no procedural defect anywhere in the process. Diane, undeterred, escalated further than any of us expected her to go. She hired an attorney and sent Ron a letter threatening a lawsuit for reputational damage, claiming he'd falsely implicated her in the fence post relocation during the board meeting. Ron, no longer willing to protect anyone but himself, forwarded her attorney every text message she'd ever sent him about the project. Those texts, turned out, included one from early April, well before the lumber ever arrived on my land. Don't worry about her side yard. She won't push back. She's new. I hadn't seen that message until Ron showed it to me himself, almost sheepishly, weeks later. Reading it landed differently than I expected. Not surprise. Exactly, I'd already understood the pattern by then, but a strange, cold clarity at seeing the calculations spelled out in her own words. Time-stamped, deliberate, made before I'd ever complained about anything at all. I forwarded the message to the new board's legal counsel, purely for the fine reversal file, not out of any personal need for further vindication. It was added, quietly, to the growing record, one more piece confirming what the neighborhood had already voted on with their own eyes. Diane's attorney reportedly advised her to drop the reputational damage claim once the text messages surfaced. Pursuing it further would have meant introducing her own written words into a public court record, which even her attorney apparently recognized as an unwinnable strategy. She didn't drop everything, though. In a strange, almost desperate pivot, she filed an individual complaint against me specifically, alleging that the storage invoice constituted harassment and demanding the new board void it retroactively as one of its first official acts under my treasurer role. The board scheduled a review, as bylaws required for any formal homeowner complaint, regardless of who filed it or against whom. I recused myself from voting, as I should have, and simply presented the original covenant language, the survey, the timeline, and let the documents argue for themselves. The remaining board members took less than 15 minutes to unanimously dismiss her complaint, noting the invoice had been calculated using language Diane herself had cited as binding against other homeowners for over a decade, including, ironically, Against me personally. Months earlier, over a garden gnome. Diane began showing up less and less at community events after that. Her once daily presence on the neighborhood Facebook group all but vanished. A few longtime residents mentioned, almost sympathetically, that they'd heard she was having a hard time adjusting to no longer holding the gavel. I felt something more complicated than satisfaction watching that particular unraveling. Not cruelty, exactly, but I also didn't feel obligated to soften it for her. She'd had 11 years and every opportunity to apply her own rules fairly. She'd chosen, repeatedly, not to. Around this time, 3 more homeowners came forward with older, previously unreported disputes dating back years, fines for a wheelchair ramp, for a xeriscaped yard that saved water during a drought, for a rainbow flag flown during Pride Month, none of which had ever been formally reversed. Each case followed a familiar shape. Someone had questioned Diane, directly or indirectly, and been fined shortly afterward under a technicality applied to no one else. The new board began systematically reviewing 3 years of fine records, cross-referencing dates against any documented conflicts with Diane specifically. The pattern that emerged was staggering once laid out on a single spreadsheet. Nearly 60% of all fines issued in the prior 3 years had gone to homeowners who had, at some point, publicly disagreed with Diane, compared to under 5% among her known allies. Frank, reviewing the data with me late one evening in the clubhouse, shook his head slowly. 60%, he repeated. That's not an interpretation issue. That's a weapon. I didn't disagree. It was the clearest, coldest confirmation yet of exactly what we'd all been living under. We drafted new enforcement guidelines that month, standardized fine schedules, a mandatory 2 board members sign off for any violation over $50, and a public quarterly ledger of all fund transactions, posted automatically, with no single person able to quietly override a request for documentation ever again. Diane, learning of the new transparency measures through the community newsletter rather than any direct notification, reportedly told a neighbor she considered it an overcorrection driven by personal vendettas. I heard about the comment secondhand and, for once, felt nothing sharp about it at all. Ron's accessory dwelling permit was formally denied by the county the following month, citing the setback violation tied directly to the moved property line. He was ordered to restore the fence to its original surveyed position at his own expense, which he did without contesting it further. He also, unprompted, sent me a second, more genuine apology, not through his attorney, not through Diane, just a note in my mailbox admitting he'd let convenience override basic respect for a neighbor's property, and that he understood, finally, why the invoice hadn't been personal at all. I appreciated that note more than I expected to. It didn't undo the months of stress, the smell of a porta-potty near my son's swing set, or the countless hours spent building a binder I never should have needed. But it was, at least, honest. Around the same time, I learned Diane had quietly listed her house for sale, a 4-bedroom colonial she'd lived in for over 15 years, the same house from which she'd run Willow Creek like a private fiefdom for nearly all of that time. Marisol texted me a screenshot of the listing with a single line, "Guess the kingdom got too small." I didn't respond with anything triumphant. I just felt, mostly, that a long, quiet chapter of unfairness in this neighborhood was finally, genuinely closing. The listing sat on the market longer than most homes in Willow Creek typically did, a fact several neighbors noted without much sympathy, given how many buyers, apparently, asked pointed questions during open houses about the HOA situation they'd read about on local community boards. I never engaged in any of that online chatter myself. I didn't need to. The recall vote, the fine reversals, the new transparency policy, all of it existed now in official record, permanent and searchable, regardless of whatever version of events Diane told herself privately. One afternoon, running into her unexpectedly at the mailbox cluster, the same spot where Ron had once quietly admitted Diane told him it'd be fine, she looked at me for a long moment before saying, simply, "I hope you're happy with what you did to this place." I told her, calmly, that I hadn't done anything to the place. I just asked the rules to apply to everyone the same way, including her. She didn't respond. Back inside without another word. And that was the last real conversation we ever had. Her house sold 2 months later, to a young couple with a toddler and, notably, a very direct list of HOA-related questions they'd asked the new board during closing, questions the board, under the new transparency policy, was able to answer honestly and completely for the first time in years. I watched the moving truck pull away from her driveway one gray Saturday morning. Eli beside me on the porch, Biscuit dozing in the sun. He asked, "Is that the mean HOA lady moving?" I told him yes. He said, "Good. She fined Frank's flagpole for no reason." I laughed. Actually laughed. For what felt like the first time in months without any tension underneath it. Even my 9-year-old had absorbed the pattern. The way kids do. Filing it away as a simple, obvious injustice that had finally, plainly, resolved itself. In the weeks after Diane's departure, the community felt different in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Neighbors greeting each other more openly, fewer anonymous complaint notices appearing on doorsteps, a general loosening of the low, constant tension I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying for months. I kept the binder, planned to throw it out now that everything was resolved. I told her no, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder of exactly how much documentation it had taken to get a rulebook applied fairly, evenly, to everyone. As treasurer, I made sure the quarterly fund ledger stayed public without exception, that vendor contracts required at least 2 competing bids, and that no single board member could unilaterally issue a fine over $50 ever again without a documented, cross-checked justification on file. Frank told me once, half joking, that Willow Creek finally had boring HOA meetings again. No dramatic reveals, no closed-door favoritism, just landscaping bids and pool schedules. The way he remembered it decades earlier before Diane's particular style of leadership had taken hold. I told him boring sounded wonderful. After everything, I developed a real appreciation for meetings where the only surprise was which pool company underbid the others, rather than which neighbor was about to be quietly punished for asking one too many honest questions. Late one evening, closing out the quarter's financial report, I found myself thinking back to that first Tuesday morning, the dump truck, the porta potty, Diane's thin smile on my porch. None of it had felt survivable in the moment. All of it, eventually, turned out to matter. By early autumn, Willow Creek had settled into a rhythm I hadn't experienced since we'd first moved in. Quiet mornings, honest board meetings, a neighborhood Facebook group that had gone back to lost cat alerts instead of veiled warnings about how things work here. I still checked the quarterly ledger obsessively out of old habit, even though nothing suspicious ever appeared in it anymore. Priya told me that instinct would probably fade eventually. Hadn't yet. Not fully, but it no longer kept me up at night the way it once had. Eli's swing set finally smelled like nothing but grass again. He'd started inviting friends over without hesitation, something he'd quietly stopped doing back when the porta potty sat 15 feet away. A detail I hadn't fully realized had affected him until he mentioned it offhand. Months later, the new HOA board held its first fully public annual meeting that October. Agenda posted a full 2 weeks in advance. Financials distributed beforehand. Public comment genuinely welcomed rather than tolerated. Attendance was strong, but for entirely different reasons than the pact. Tense meeting months earlier. People came now out of genuine interest, not fear or vindication. Landscaping proposals. A community garden idea Marisol had been quietly championing for years without ever feeling safe enough to formally propose it under the old leadership. Passed unanimously, almost as an afterthought. On its first reading, I gave a short treasurer's report that night, walking through the fund reconciliation, the new vendor bidding process, the fine reversals completed for every homeowner wrongfully charged over the prior 3 years, including, at last, formal refunds issued to the Hendersons, the retired teacher, and the young couple with the basketball hoop. Frank, sitting in the front row, gave me a small nod when I finished. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No applause. No speeches. Just a room full of neighbors quietly. Finally, treating a board meeting as ordinary business rather than a battlefield they had to brace themselves for. Ron showed up to that meeting too, which surprised me a little. He sat near the back, said nothing during public comment, but approached me afterward to ask, sincerely, whether the community garden might need help from someone who, as he put it, actually knows how to build things properly this time. I told him that was up to Marisol's committee, not me, but I appreciated the offer. Felt like a small, genuine gesture from someone who'd learned something real from the whole ordeal, rather than simply waited it out hoping everyone would eventually forget. I never heard from Diane again after the moving truck pulled away that gray Saturday morning. No calls, no letters, no lingering presence on any community platform. Marisol mentioned once, secondhand, that she'd heard Diane had joined a different HOA board 2 towns over. I felt an odd mix of things hearing that, mild disbelief that anyone would hand her that kind of authority again so soon, and a quiet hope that this time, wherever she'd landed, someone would build their own binder faster than I had, and hold the line sooner. I thought, more than once, about writing an anonymous note to that other HOA. Some kind of warning. Priya talked me out of it. You already did the work here, she said. Let this place be the thing you fixed. You don't have to fix every place. She was right, though it took me a while to fully accept it. My responsibility had always been to my own yard, my own son, my own neighborhood, not to police every HOA president who might someday repeat Diane's particular pattern somewhere else, with someone else, over something else entirely. The community garden broke ground that November, on a small unused lot near the clubhouse, funded transparently through the same beautification fund Diane had once quietly siphoned from, now overseen by a rotating committee. 3 competing landscaping bids required for anything over $200. I planted the first row of bulbs myself, Eli beside me with a small trowel, Biscuit sniffing at freshly turned dirt. It felt almost absurdly ordinary, digging in soil on a cool autumn afternoon. And that ordinariness was, after everything, exactly what I'd been fighting for the whole time. Looking back at my old spreadsheet, the one I'd first labeled Ron Stuff, then renamed Exhibit a half as a joke, I realized how much had changed since that first tab. What started as documentation of a nuisance had ended up rewriting how an entire neighborhood governed itself. I kept that spreadsheet, too, alongside the binder, in a folder I labeled simply 2024, not for any legal reason anymore. Just as a private record of exactly how much a person can accomplish by staying calm, staying organized, and refusing to accept that's how it works here as a final answer. A reporter from a small local paper reached out that winter, having heard through community channels about the recall and the audit, asking if I'd be willing to talk about the HOA whistleblower story. I declined, gently. It wasn't a story I wanted turned into neighborhood spectacle. I told her, simply, that I hadn't set out to be a whistleblower. I'd only ever wanted a porta-potty removed from beside my son's swing set, and everything after that had just been a matter of applying the community's own rules honestly, evenly, to everyone, including the person who wrote them. She ran a short piece anyway, without my direct quotes, focused instead on the broader pattern of unchecked HOA authority across the region, using Willow Creek's audit findings, now public record, as one example among several similar stories from neighboring counties. Reading it, I felt a strange, distant satisfaction. Not because my name was in it, it wasn't, but because the underlying pattern, the one I'd spent months proving with photographs and covenant clauses and a single stubborn storage fee invoice, was apparently far more common than I'd assumed. That winter, the new board finalized a permanent policy requiring any future fine dispute over a certain dollar amount to automatically trigger a documented review by at least 3 board members, specifically to prevent any single person from ever again wielding that kind of unchecked personal discretion. We named it, half-jokingly during the drafting session, the Section 9 safeguard, a quiet nod, among the handful of us who'd lived through it, to the very covenant clause that had started the entire unraveling, the one everyone had assumed was too old and too obscure to ever matter. Marisol suggested we frame a copy of the original covenant page, the one Diane had scanned and sent me back in April, thinking it would intimidate me into compliance, and hang it in the clubhouse, as both a historical record and a quiet reminder for whoever served next. I liked that idea more than I expected to. Not as a trophy, exactly, but as evidence that the rules, applied honestly, had always contained the tools needed to correct themselves. It had simply taken one homeowner willing to actually read every word of them, carefully, all the way through. Eli, now 10, still occasionally brought up the toilet summer at dinner, usually to make his friends laugh when they came over. I let him tell it his way, dramatized, a little exaggerated, missing most of the financial nuance because the core of it was, honestly, still true. A mean neighbor lady tried to push us around, and we didn't let her, and eventually the whole neighborhood agreed we were right. That was the 10-year-old's version. It wasn't wrong. The 11 years of quiet unfairness that had made it necessary in the first place. By the following spring, exactly 1 year after the dump truck first backed onto my lawn, Willow Creek held its annual spring picnic, an event Diane had always run with rigid, joyless precision. This year it felt looser, warmer, genuinely communal in a way I hadn't experienced there before. I sat with Marisol and Frank near the new community garden, watching Eli chase Biscuit across the grass, and thought, not for the first time, how strange it was that a stack of lumber dumped illegally on my lawn had ended up fixing something far bigger than my own yard. The following August, almost exactly 16 months after that first Tuesday morning, I received a call from a homeowner in the HOA 2 towns over, the one Marisol had mentioned Diane had joined. Her name was Patricia, and she sounded exhausted in a way I recognized immediately. "I heard you had trouble with an HOA president who used to run Willow Creek," Patricia said. "I think the same person is on our board now, doing something eerily similar to what happened to you. I found your name through that local newspaper piece from last winter. I hadn't wanted to be found through that article, but I listened anyway." Patricia described a familiar pattern: inconsistent fines, an unaccounted fund, a contractor connected to a board member's family, homeowners too intimidated to push back after watching one neighbor get hit with a lien threat. I asked her, carefully, whether the covenant documents at her HOA were fully accessible to homeowners, and whether anyone had requested the original certified copies rather than relying on whatever scanned version the board provided. She admitted she hadn't thought to ask for that distinction before. I spent almost 2 hours on the phone with her that evening. Not as a whistleblower, not as any kind of activist, just as one homeowner who'd learned, the hard way, exactly which questions actually mattered and which ones a determined board president could smoothly deflect forever. I sent her Priya's contact information, with Priya's permission, and a short summary of what documentation had ultimately made the biggest difference in my own case. Not outrage, not confrontation, just dates, photographs, and the original text of rules already sitting quietly in an old filing cabinet. 2 weeks later, Patricia called again, this time audibly relieved. She'd requested the certified original covenants for her own HOA and found, buried in nearly identical language to Willow Creek's, an almost forgotten clause requiring competitive bidding for any vendor contract over a certain threshold. Diane, turned out, had been awarding contracts there too, to a landscaping company owned by a close friend, without a single competing bid in over 2 years. Patricia's community was already organizing a petition, modeled loosely on the one that had triggered Willow Creek's original audit. I felt something unexpectedly steady hearing that, not vindictive satisfaction, but a kind of quiet closure. Diane hadn't reformed after Willow Creek. She'd simply relocated the same pattern somewhere new, assuming, apparently, that a fresh community wouldn't have anyone willing to actually read the fine print. This time, though, someone had. I offered Patricia one piece of advice above everything else. Don't confront the board president directly first. Build the file quietly, completely, before anyone even knows you're building it. It had worked once. Again. Over the following month, I stayed loosely in touch with Patricia as her community's petition gathered signatures, careful to remain a resource rather than a participant. This wasn't my neighborhood, my fight, or my story to lead. Only one I could help equip someone else to carry. In October, Patricia texted me a single photo, a printed audit request, 5 signatures at the bottom, the same emergency bylaw language Willow Creek had used over a year earlier. Section 9 Safeguard, she wrote underneath it, only half joking, echoing the phrase Marisol had coined for our own clubhouse plaque. I didn't hear the full outcome of that particular board's recall vote until months later, secondhand through Patricia, who told me simply that Diane had resigned before the vote could even be formally held, choosing to leave quietly rather than face a second public unraveling in front of a second community. I felt no need to celebrate that news loudly. I mentioned it once, briefly, to Priya over coffee, who said only, "Some people learn. Some people just keep moving until they find somewhere nobody's paying attention yet." I suspected, privately, Diane fell into the second category, and probably always would. Back home in Willow Creek, our own community continued on its steadier, quieter path, the community garden thriving into its second season, the fine reversal fund fully closed out, the quarterly ledger a routine, unremarkable habit rather than a battleground anyone had to fight to see. I stepped down as treasurer that winter, having served a full term, replaced by Marisol, who'd earned it many times over through her own quiet persistence during the hardest months. I stayed on the board in a smaller advisory role, mostly reviewing new homeowner onboarding materials for clarity. One of the first things we added to that onboarding packet was the full, plain language covenant document, not a summarized version, not a scanned excerpt, but the entire original text, every clause, every subsection, so no future homeowner would ever have to discover Section 9 the way I had. Eli, now 11, occasionally helped me stuff those onboarding envelopes for new families moving in, still half proud of the toilet summer story he told his friends, still slightly disappointed, in a very 10-year-old turned 11-year-old way, that the porta potty itself hadn't made it into any official plaque. I told him some details were better left out of the historical record. He accepted this with the particular gravity children reserved for genuinely important matters, and went back to carefully folding welcome letters, one for each new family who would, I hoped, never need a binder like mine. That spring, almost 2 full years after the dump truck first backed onto my lawn, a new family moved in 3 houses down, a young couple, first-time homeowners, nervous about HOA rules the way I'd once been, though for entirely different, far less complicated reasons than mine had turned out to be. I brought them a small welcome basket, as was becoming something of a habit in the new, warmer Willow Creek, and mentioned, almost offhand, that if they ever had any questions about the covenants, the full text was always available, no scanned excerpts, no board interpretation required. The young husband laughed and said, "Good, because HOAs have kind of a reputation." I smiled and told him, honestly, that ours had earned that reputation once, badly, but that the neighborhood had worked hard to become something different since. He seemed to genuinely believe me. I believed it too. Looking back across those 2 years, I found myself returning most often not to the board meetings, or the audit findings, or even the recall vote itself, but to that first quiet moment on my kitchen table, Section 9, subsection C. Read once, then twice, then a third time. Hadn't known, in that moment, that a single overlooked clause in a decades-old document would eventually unravel 11 years of quiet, unchecked authority. I'd only known it was true, and that truth, applied evenly and without exception, turned out to be a far sharper tool than anger ever could have been. Ron and I became, if not close friends, at least genuinely cordial neighbors. He'd finished his home responsibly under proper permits. The accessory unit reworked into a modest, code-compliant home office instead, and he occasionally waved from his porch with none of the old careless breeziness left in it. He told me once, almost apologetically, that he still thought about that first invoice sometimes, not with resentment, he clarified, but as a kind of permanent, useful reminder that borrowing someone else's space, even briefly, even innocently, always eventually comes with an actual, calculable cost. I told him I appreciated hearing that, and meant it. Not every difficult neighbor stays difficult forever. Some, given the right consequence at the right moment, actually reflect, adjust, and become better ones, which felt, in its own quiet way, like its own small, satisfying kind of ending. Diane, as far as I ever learned, never returned to any HOA leadership position again after the second resignation. Whether that was a personal choice or simply a lack of any remaining community willing to hand her that kind of authority, I never found out, and eventually stopped wondering. What I did know, with total certainty, was this: a woman who had spent 11 years treating a shared rulebook as a private weapon had, in the end, been undone by that exact same rulebook, applied honestly, patiently, and without exception, by someone she'd once dismissed as simply new. I think about that irony often, usually while watering the small garden bed I keep near my own back fence, the same fence line Ron had once quietly moved, now surveyed, marked, and permanently restored to its original, honest position, exactly where it had always legally belonged. The binder still sits on a shelf in my home office, spine slightly worn now, tabs a little faded. I don't look at it often anymore, but I keep it, deliberately, as a reminder that fairness, when it's actually threatened, rarely restores itself. Someone has to go get it. It was Eli, oddly enough, who gave the whole ordeal its final, unexpected coda. That spring, his 5th grade class assignment was to interview a family member about a time you solved a hard problem, and without asking me first, he chose the storage fee story as his subject. He presented it to his class with a hand-drawn timeline, a dump truck, a porta-potty with a frowny face, a stick figure Diane with an exaggerated scowl, and a giant $sign labeled 23X at the very end, underlined 3 times for emphasis, in his own careful handwriting. His teacher called me afterward, laughing, to say it had been the most detailed and oddly specific civics lesson she'd received from a 10-year-old in years, and asked, half seriously, whether I'd be willing to speak briefly to the class about reading contracts and standing up for yourself calmly. I agreed, mostly because Eli was so visibly proud, standing near the front of the classroom while I explained, in the simplest terms I could manage, that rules only protect people when everyone, including the people in charge, has to follow them exactly the same way. One student raised her hand and asked if I'd ever been scared during any of it. I told her the truth. Yes, often, especially at the very beginning, but that staying calm and writing things down had mattered far more, in the end, than staying fearless the whole time. Eli beamed through the entire visit, and afterward, walking to the car, told me it was the best project ever, which felt like its own small, unexpected form of closure, the whole difficult saga finally settling, in my son's mind, into something simple, understandable, and quietly triumphant. That same week, the framed covenant page Marisol had suggested finally went up in the clubhouse, beside a small typed plaque reading only, "Rules apply to everyone, evenly, without exception. A lesson learned the hard way, and never to be forgotten again." No names. No details. I stood in front of it the day it was hung. Frank beside me, both of us quiet for a moment. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" he said. "Something that ordinary hanging on a wall like that." I told him ordinary was exactly the point. Fairness shouldn't require a plaque. But sometimes it does. Marisol joined us a moment later, coffee in hand, and the three of us stood there a while longer, not saying much else, just looking at a yellowed photocopy of Section 9. Subsection C. Finally framed, finally visible, finally treated like the binding, ordinary rule it had always actually been. The porta-potty, the lumber, the cinder blocks, all of it long gone by then, the grass fully regrown over where they'd once sat. Eli's swing set creaked in the wind exactly the way it had before any of this started, as if the whole difficult year had simply folded itself away. But the neighborhood underneath it hadn't folded away at all. It had actually changed, transparently governed now, evenly enforced, run by neighbors who'd learned, together and the hard way, exactly what it cost to look away from unfairness for too long, and exactly what it took to finally stop. I never set out to become the person who reformed an entire HOA. I only ever wanted a dump truck's worth of someone else's construction materials off my son's swing set. Everything else, the audit, the recall, the plaque, the framed clause, grew from that one simple, stubborn refusal to quietly accept it. Looking back, I think that's the part I'd want any future homeowner reading the onboarding packet to understand most. Unfairness rarely announces itself as something enormous. It usually starts small. A pile of lumber, a garden gnome fine, a phrase like, "That's just how we do things here." What matters is whether you let that phrase stand unquestioned, or whether you go find, read, and hold up the actual rule underneath it, because more often than anyone expects, the rule was already fair all along. It just needed someone patient enough to finally, properly enforce it. Diane had counted on exactly one thing throughout all of it, that I, as a new homeowner, wouldn't know the rules well enough to challenge her interpretation of them. She'd been right about nearly everyone else in Willow Creek for 11 straight years. She simply hadn't counted on an accountant. Numbers, I've come to believe, don't care how long you've held a gavel, how many tennis whites you own, or how many people are too intimidated to check your math. They simply are what they are. And once someone finally writes them down clearly, they're remarkably hard to argue with. 23 times the base storage rate. One overlooked covenant clause. One dump truck that should never have backed onto my lawn in the first place. That was, in the end, all it ever actually took to unravel 11 years of quiet, unchecked, comfortable authority in Willow Creek. I still live here, in the same house, on the same cul-de-sac, watching Eli grow taller by the season and the community garden fill out a little more with every passing year. Willow Creek isn't perfect. No neighborhood ever is. But it is, finally, genuinely, fair. And every so often, usually in early spring, when a new delivery truck rumbles down our street for some other family's renovation, I find myself glancing instinctively toward the property line, Not with old anxiety anymore. Just quiet, habitual vigilance. The useful kind that fairness, once won, still requires to keep. Because rules, I learned, don't enforce themselves. Someone always has to actually read them, hold them up to the light, and refuse to let anyone, however long they've held the gavel, however confidently they say, that's just how we do things here, quietly decide otherwise. That, more than any invoice, any audit, or any recall vote, is the real ending of this story. Not that a Karen got what was coming to her, though she certainly did, but that an entire neighborhood finally remembered its own rules were meant to protect everyone. Evenly, without exception. A year after the plaque went up, Willow Creek's board sent out its first ever fully transparent annual report. Every dollar accounted for, every vendor bid documented, every fine issued with a clear, publicly available justification attached. Exactly the kind of ordinary, boring governance the neighborhood had always deserved. Patricia's community, 2 towns over, followed a similar path within the year, adopting its own version of the Section 9 safeguard, now something of a quiet, informal template quietly passed between a handful of HOAs across the region whenever a similar pattern threatened to take root. Ron finished his modest home office that summer, fully permitted, properly set back from the property line, and hosted a small neighborhood barbecue to celebrate, inviting me first, almost ceremonially, as if closing a loop that had opened, uncomfortably, with a dump truck more than 2 years earlier. I brought a store-bought pie, not out of any grand gesture, just because that's what neighbors bring each other. Ordinarily, when nothing complicated is happening between them anymore. Eli played in Ron's new yard with the neighbor kids while Biscuit dozed contentedly in the shade nearby. Standing there that afternoon, watching an entirely unremarkable summer barbecue unfold in a yard that had once held a stack of illegally dumped construction materials, I felt something settle in me completely. Not triumph, not relief exactly anymore. Just the quiet satisfaction of a thing finally, fully resolved. People sometimes ask me, when the story comes up, whether it was worth the months of stress, the binders, the certified letters, the sleepless nights running numbers on a kitchen table calculator. I always tell them the same thing. I didn't do it to win. I did it because fair was worth fighting for. And in the end, fair won not through anger, not through revenge, but through one overlooked clause, patiently enforced, exactly as written, against the one person who'd always assumed the rules were only ever meant for everybody else. Willow Creek is quiet again now, the good kind of quiet, and every spring, when new bulbs come up in the community garden, I think, just briefly, about a porta-potty, a garden gnome, and 23 times the storage fee, the strange, stubborn beginning of a much fairer neighborhood.